Okay, well, can everybody hear me okay? Great. So I'm Dr. Steve Roels. I'm the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team Coordinator with American Bird Conservancy. So I am the chief cat herder of the members of the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team, which is a consortium of public agencies, nonprofits, university researchers, and other interested parties that all make up the conservation team and all have a stake in the management of the Kirtland's Warbler and its ongoing recovery and recent delisting from the U.S. endangered species list. I just started in my position in August. Very excited to be working back in my home state of Michigan after a few years out in Colorado, where I was working in natural resources management for a suburb of Denver. My Ph.D. is from Michigan State, where I studied tropical bird ecology in forest restorations in Panama. But I'm particularly tickled to be able to do work with Kirtland's Warbler. I taught the ornithology lab at Michigan State for 4 years, and I had a lecture about bird conservation that was centered around the story of the Kirtland's Warbler and its listing, its decline and listing on the endangered species list and subsequent recovery. So it's a pretty exciting position for me to be in. So, all right, well, I'm going to get started here sharing the screen. Okay, can everybody see that title slide? Lisa nods yes. All right, well, we'll get started. So the title of my talk this evening is Bird on the Move, Looking to the Past to Secure the Future of the Kirtland's Warbler. And throughout this talk, we're going to focus a lot on the movement ecology of Kirtland's Warbler and what that means, both in terms of the history of the warbler as a species, but also what it means for the future of the bird heading into a period of great global uncertainty, which includes Michigan and all the habitats therein when it comes to a climate change century that we're really just getting started. So I know that the Petoskey Regional Audubon Society is already quite familiar with Kirtland's Warbler, so I'll just give a brief overview of Kirtland's Warbler ecology. So the Kirtland's Warbler is a migratory songbird which breeds almost exclusively in the jack pine forests of Michigan, particularly in the northern lower peninsula. They winter almost entirely in the Bahamas and really even just a handful of islands in the Bahamas, where they prefer early successional scrub forests, so areas that have experienced some kind of a disturbance in the past and are regenerating, and that's where they tend to be found. And in both Michigan and the Bahamas, they are dependent on disturbance regimes to create early successional habitat that they prefer, both for their breeding biology and then also in their overwintering territories. Because of this dependence on very particular kinds of habitat, especially in Michigan, the Kirtland's Warbler nearly went extinct in the mid-20th century, bottoming out somewhere a little bit under perhaps 400 individuals, which is just incredibly close to extinction. But through several decades of really intensive conservation effort by people like agencies of the Michigan DNR and the U.S. Forest Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as a whole cadre of university researchers focused on understanding this bird better. Kirtland's Warbler was actually taken off the endangered species list in 2019, which was really an incredible conservation success story. One of the very few species that has been taken off the endangered species list for reasons of recovery and not because it actually went extinct. So it's really a shining example of how a concerted conservation effort can pay off and can result in conservation successes. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk a lot about different kinds of scales and the processes that operate at those scales and how the bird is responding to forces that act on the different scales that the bird experiences. So I want to give some examples of particular kinds of scales. So we have, for example, generational scales. So here we're talking about like an individual generation of the Kirtland's warbler. So that's usually birds are breeding within their second year, so generations for the warbler are quite short. And then we can also look at the smallest scale for geography of the bird. So we've got our time scales and we have geographical scales. So here we're talking about a very local scale, something like the individual territory size of a Kirtland's warbler. And then if we zoom out a little bit in terms of our scales, we're looking at bigger time scales. Now we're thinking about things like geologic ages. So the fluctuations of ice ages as they come and go. So that particular graph there shows variations in the volume of ice in the glacial periods and changes in global temperatures. But then we can also look at the intermediate scale for geography, which in this case would be a regional scale, looking at something like the region of the northern lower peninsula of Michigan or the eastern upper peninsula of Michigan. And then if we zoom out even further, we can think about really big time scales, and we can think about things like evolutionary time scales, millions of years, for the Kirtland's warbler, its history as a species, and then also the biggest geographic scale, we can think about a hemispheric scale where the warbler, because it's a migratory species, is traveling thousands of miles across the surface of the globe and really interacts with a very large portion of the biosphere. So thinking about threats to the future of the Kirtland's warbler. And you know what? I'm going to pause right here because I am operating on the wrong version of my PowerPoint slides. So I'm gonna swap this out. I was working on these late last night, and I think I'm in the wrong one. I will be right back with slides. Okay. This is what happens when you work on your slides at midnight, the night before a presentation. But we had a big Kirtland's Warbler conservation team meeting today, and so I was focused on preparing for that, and clearly didn't do quite as much preparation as I needed to for this talk. Okay, we're going to try this again. Okay, can everybody see where we are here? Yes, all right, apologies for the interruption. So we're talking about the threats to the future of Kirtland's warbler. And it's important to think about how there's always threats to every species. There's those threats that are always around, things like novel disease outbreak, a geologic event, a volcano goes off somewhere, there's an earthquake. In the case of Kirtland's warbler, there's the fact that it's just a specialized species in terms of its habitat affiliations. And so there's some risk of disruption to that particular kind of habitat. And then there's also natural climate change, which occurs. And, those are things that exist for all species. Species do naturally go, they appear, they naturally go extinct. But really what we need to focus on is the threats that we're morally responsible for, because they're threats that are caused by human action. So these are things including human development. And we normally think about human development as a threat to Kirtland's warbler in just the span of the last couple hundred years. But it is important to remember that Kirtland's warbler has been exposed to the effects of human activities and changes to the landscape by humans for actually probably over 1,000 years. If we think about the earliest colonization of the Bahamas, for example, or even several thousand years, if we think about the indigenous peoples of Michigan and how they were changing the landscape. So that wasn't necessarily a threat, but it was definitely something that was changing the environment that the warbler had to navigate. Other major threats to the warbler are things like domestic cats, which are perhaps not a huge threat on the breeding ground, but certainly a threat on the wintering grounds, as well as during migration. It's exposed to a lot of predators in areas that individual birds might not be so familiar. There's also the story of the cowbird, how exposure to cowbird nest parasitism was one of the primary reasons that the Kirtland's warbler had very low breeding success for many decades and caused that population decline to near extinction. And then we can also think about even more recent threats than those. Think about things like the presence of windows, which are a hazard during migration, especially, and particularly windows that are associated with coastal high rises. Things that are built up on the shorelines of the Great Lakes are particularly a migratory hazard for Kirtland's warbler. And then finally, we can think about anthropogenic climate change, which is just barely getting started here, as the newest threat that Kirtland's warbler really needs to try to navigate. Okay, so we talked already about how Kirtland's warbler is operating on these different scales. And what I want to do is I want to also take a step back and think about how does climate change operate on all these scales that the warbler is also functionally operating in. And so for climate change is obviously, we talk about global climate change because it's occurring at all of these different geographical scales, the local, the regional, and the hemispheric scale. And I mentioned natural climate change, which typically would be occurring on those bigger time scales, geologic age and evolutionary time scales, whereas anthropogenic climate change, we're actually talking about significant climate change happening on generational scales, climate change that's happening in just decades or maybe a century, which gives a species much less time to adapt. So let's look at what climate change is going to be doing in the environments that the Kirtland's warbler depends on. So on the breeding grounds in principally northern Michigan, but also some of the breeding areas in Wisconsin and Ontario, climate change is likely to cause things like higher temperatures, which can stress out jack pine. If you look at a jack pine distribution map, you'll see that the major area of Kirtland's warbler breeding is actually in the southern edge of the jack pine distribution. And so these jack pines are probably already a little bit under temperature stress in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan, which seems funny to think about things being under heat stress in northern Michigan, but that's the case for jack pine. So this climate change may result in potentially slower growth of the trees or higher mortality. The photo that I have here is a photo that I took in a jack pine plantation that was intended to be Kirtland's warbler habitat, but actually failed to provide good habitat because there was a drought that occurred the same year that the trees were planted, and there was very high mortality of the seedlings, and the resulting jack pine stand was not dense enough to be suitable habitat for Kirtland's warbler. Climate change can also cause, in addition to droughts, can cause floods. One of the reasons that Kirtland's warbler really likes the northern lower peninsula of Michigan is because of the glacial outwash soils that are quite well drained. As a ground nesting bird, Kirtland's warbler can't get flooded out in high precipitation events. But if those become more intense, some of the areas that are not quite so well drained that normally would be suitable for breeding habitat might actually get flooded out and cause nest failure. There's also the possibility of heat waves, which would stress both the birds and all of the components of the ecosystem, including its food sources like insects. And then another one that sometimes gets overlooked with climate change is thinking about asynchronous phenology. So the migration of Kirtland's warbler is timed very carefully such that the birds arrive on the breeding grounds right about the time that there's available food for them to eat. There's enough insects for them to consume and then also feed their young. But if spring basically happens earlier in this part of Michigan, will the warbler, once it arrives, actually be too late for that first big flush of insects at the start of the spring, disrupting some of its ability to breed successfully? So now let's think about climate change on the other end of the Kirtland's warbler life cycle. So people like to think about migratory birds going down to tropical latitudes because it's like, oh, it's just, I'm on vacation, right? I can just kick back, eat a few insects, eat a little bit of fruit. Life is good on the islands. But it turns out that the Bahamas are not really such a benign climate as what people think they are. So the Kirtland's warbler is quite focused even within the Bahamas, principally on a handful of islands in the center part of the archipelago. And it's worth noting that the land area where the Kirtland's warbler is found is quite small. These islands are very flat. So here's some aerial photos looking at islands in the Bahamas, and you can see how there's almost no topography here at all. And what that means is that these islands are extremely vulnerable to hurricanes, to loss of land area should there be sea level rise, and also the salination of the water table. So as sea levels are rising and these islands have very little fresh water, there's actually, you can get intrusion of brackish water up into the water table from having a higher ocean level, such that there's even less fresh water, which impacts some of the vegetation that the Kirtland's warbler needs in order to survive. And one other aspect about the Bahamas that can be challenging for Kirtland's warbler is that there tend to be droughts in the late part of the winter. So there was some research done by Rockwell et al. That showed that annual survival of Kirtland's warblers is strongly correlated with the amount of rainfall, specifically in the month of March. Which is right before they're getting ready to migrate. This is the driest part of the year. And the model that they developed suggested that even a 12% decline in average rainfall during the month of March for the central Bahamas could cause an overall declining population trend for the entire species. So we're talking about something that is really a pretty narrow margin between having a population that's increasing, which Kirtland's warbler still is doing, and having a population that's decreasing potentially so drastically that it ends up back on the endangered species list. But we can, however, look to the warbler and think about how it has adapted in the past. It's got a lot of adapting to do that we'll need to do in the future with climate change. And we can think about the scales on which it's had to adapt as well. So evolutionary biology studies of Kirtland's warbler have concluded that the warbler as a species is probably about 2 million years old. So if we think about what the Kirtland's warbler has seen in that 2 million years, it's seen a lot of global change. This map that I have on the screen right now, this is the last glacial maximum. So this is the last period in which the polar ice caps got to their furthest extent. This would be right about 10,000 years ago. That red arrow there is for Petoskey. It says you are here 10,000 years ago under 2 miles of ice. So if we think, all right, this is now Kirtland's warbler habitat, it obviously could not have been Kirtland's warbler habitat just 10,000 years ago. And so that raises the question of where were Kirtland's warblers when everything in Michigan was buried under miles of ice? And if we look at this graph here, you can ignore the details, but just focus on how the black line here, this is land area in the Bahamas, and the white line is sea level. And so the orange arrow there shows where we currently are. We've got very little land area in the Bahamas with a high sea level. And what we see looking back at this paleoclimate model is that this isn't unprecedented. There have been multiple periods in the last 500,000 years where there's been very limited land area available in the Bahamas for wintering Kirtland's warblers, if we even assume Kirtland's warblers were wintering in the Bahamas, say 400,000 years ago. But I think what really drives home this impressive amount of change that we see in the Bahamas with changing climates is this map right here. So this map shows all the areas that would have been land during that last glacial maximum. So this is when sea level is about 40 meters lower than what it is currently, which has happened repeatedly during the history of Kirtland's warblers as a species. You see this kind of land area in the Northern Caribbean, which is just remarkable. You see how much more land there is in the Bahamas. There's whole major islands in the Caribbean that we don't even think about today. I mean, there's an island on the south end of Jamaica that's not even there right now. And so Kirtland's warblers have been navigating this ebb and flow of land area on their presumed wintering grounds through the millennia. And we're headed in a period where that land area may be changing quite rapidly. In addition, Kirtland's warbler has experienced this very recent collapse in its overall range. It was a more widespread species, still a habitat specialist, but with populations in Wisconsin, populations in throughout northern Michigan, and then also into Ontario and possibly even Quebec. So that collapse and now its subsequent recovery, where the range is now expanding outside of the northern lower peninsula of Michigan again, that has all happened within only about 20 or 30 generations of Kirtland's warblers. And it's managed to come through that okay, and even with quite a bit of the original genetic diversity. So thinking about all these different scales on which these things occur, the evolutionary scale, the geologic scale, the generational scale, and then our spatial scales of the local, the regional, and the hemispheric scale, we really need to start thinking about how Kirtland's warbler interacts with these scales in terms of its ability to move. And one of the most helpful things to do is actually look at some of the movement ecology research that has recently revealed some things about Kirtland's warbler's basic biology. So movement ecology, how we learn about bird movements, there's a number of different techniques. So first, you can just have documented sightings. People out finding birds with a pair of binoculars, like these three gentlemen here, which you may recall from a popular birding-related movie from a few years ago. But then there's also technologies like bird banding birds, figuring out when they are recovered elsewhere, where was that bird originally banded, perhaps where it was born. Now it's down in the Bahamas. We can directly connect an individual bird to two different locations at different times of the year. There's also radio tracking, which is using tiny transmitters on individual birds and pinpointing their location through triangulation around on the landscape, which works at a kind of an intermediate scale based on the range of an individual radio antenna that can be mounted on a bird as small as a Kirtland's warbler. There's also stable isotopes, which are a geochemical approach where you can actually look at the chemistry of individual feathers and infer things about where birds may have spent the winter. But it's so technical, I couldn't even find a good photo to explain what it is. But now we're getting into more modern techniques of movement ecology, things like geolocator. If you look at this photo here, you see a tiny little thing sticking off the back of this Kirtland's warbler, which is a geolocator antenna. So these work kind of like a radio tracker, except that they work over greater distances, and they actually they log data based on the location of the bird, including things like the timing of sunrise and sunset. And so if these birds can be recaptured, you can get that data. But the problem with geolocators is that you can't actually transmit the data from the geolocator. You need to physically recover it from a bird. So you can imagine that is quite a challenge to pick up an individual bird on one end of migration or the other from where it was originally tagged with a geolocator. But what we have now, this is a brand new tracking technology, is called MODIS towers. So this is basically using the same technology as radio transmitter tracking, but this is radio 2.0. So this is building out a network, like a big scale, country scale network of radio towers that can pick up the transceivers on individual birds. And so this is, you can conceptually think of it as basically like a cell tower network, where regardless of where these birds are, if they are within the transmission range of a tower that someone has put up, that tower will detect them and then say, we know where this bird is. And the really exciting thing about MODIS is that these networks are getting built out quite rapidly and at large scales. So there are MODIS towers in northern Michigan, but there are also MODIS towers, for example, all over Florida. So when a bird with a MODIS tag flies through Florida on its way to the Bahamas, those towers passively pick up its location and upload that information to cloud servers that then make that data available to researchers. So there's some really exciting things that we've just been able to learn about Kirtland's warbler using some of these very recent movement ecology techniques. So what is it that we've learned just in the last couple of years about Kirtland's warblers? First, their migration pattern. So this first map that I have here, this is the routes of Kirtland's warblers leaving the Bahamas and heading to northern Michigan in the spring. And while there's some scatter, you can generally see there's kind of an arced line there that follows the main route of Kirtland's warblers as they're leaving the Bahamas, hitting the mainland somewhere in coastal Florida, working their way up through Georgia and continuing through the Southern Appalachian Mountains, through the Midwest, principally Ohio, into Michigan. And so you might think from these data, okay, great. We know where the Kirtland's warbler is migrating through. We know areas to look for it in migration. We know areas where we might need to protect key stopover sites. But the situation is additionally complicated by the fact that this isn't the route the Kirtland's warbler takes in the fall. There's a subtle difference here. So this is the fall route of Kirtland's warblers that have been tagged with geolocators and MODIS transmitters that shows that in the fall, Kirtland's warblers are actually migrating. And this is almost 2,000 miles that they're tracking, but they tend to track a little bit to the east. So instead of flying through the Southern Appalachian Mountains, they're actually crossing these mountains more in the Pennsylvania, West Virginia area. And they hit the coast of the Carolinas, and most of them fly out over the open ocean to get to the Bahamas, taking advantage of tailwinds that are out in the open ocean that kind of slingshot them down to the islands. So this is really interesting and has some implications for how we think about how the birds are using space on this very large scale, this hemispheric scale. We can also look at a smaller scale, at this local and regional scale, how are birds moving at that scale? And I'll back up. I don't want to give away my punchline here quite yet. So The assumption for a long time was that birds that either didn't breed or birds that were post-breeding were just sort of hanging out. They were just kind of kicking around on the landscape. They're hanging out in the breeding colonies in northern Michigan and not really going anywhere. And then migration period comes. Okay, it's time to go to the Bahamas. Let's take off. That was the assumption because we didn't have any data that demonstrated they were doing anything but that. But the reality revealed by MODIS towers is that birds that are not actively feeding young, taking care of young birds, they are prospecting hard. What this graphic shows is that we've got a period here. These lines, this is movement. These are long distance movements of birds. These are movements that are on the order of 10 to even up to about 70 kilometers. And the number of birds that are making these long distance movements such that they're getting picked up by a completely different MODIS tower in a different part of the state, or even maybe a different country, somewhere like Ontario. And the relative timing of these long distance movements based on the breeding biology. And so the interpretation of these data is that birds that are not currently raising their young, they're free to move around. What are they doing? They're not just loafing around waiting for migration to start. They are out there prospecting for other areas they could go. Say, okay, well, this area didn't work for me. I didn't find a mate, or my nest was predated, or something else happened. I need to find another place to go. And so they're ping-ponging around on the landscape, looking for other suitable habitat because whatever habitat they picked out that spring just didn't work for some reason. And so they're actually very, very active during this period where birds that have nestlings or fledglings are tied down to those territories. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of Kirtland's warblers' climate adaptation toolbox? How are they going to respond to climate change, to the somewhat dire scenario that I showed with major changes on both the breeding grounds and the wintering grounds? Well, they've got a number of things that they can use to help them adapt. First off, migratory birds. These are birds that have the physiological skills to travel thousands of miles, which gives them a lot of options in terms of moving around on the landscape. They also, because they are reliant on this ephemeral habitat, they are naturally moving around looking for habitat that is perhaps a little bit better than these areas where the trees are just a little too big or not dense enough. But their habitat just goes away. So the biology of the species is already geared for them to be moving around on the landscape, trying to find these additional patches of habitat, which naturally would have been created by random wildfires. Then they have their site fidelity or lack thereof. So individual birds, they can change sites from one year to the next. There's a record of at least one individual bird that lived up to 10 years, which is about the duration that an individual patch of Kirtland's warbler young successional jack pine habitat would even be suitable. So it's quite likely that some individual birds may start breeding in one location, one habitat patch, but during their lifespan, that habitat will no longer be suitable for them, so they need to jump around. So that's sort of the lack of site fidelity of an individual. And then also we can see evidence for the recovery of this population from its population crash and endangered species status, now coming back up. And we see this recolonization of the historic range of the Kirtland's warbler. So what I have here in this map, this is eBird data that I just pulled a couple days ago. And what you see are all the little blue pins, which are places that Kirtland's warbler has been found. And I was looking at these data a couple months ago, and I saw a couple of points way out here in Ontario. And I thought, no, what's going on there? Are these errors? What are these points? And so I zoomed in on Ontario. So now this is Algonquin Provincial Park. just for context. Lake Huron would be off the map this way. And I assumed right away I'd heard about this location called Petawawa, where Kirtland's warblers, just a handful of them, but they were known to breed. And so when I saw the blue pins on the map way out in Ontario, I thought, oh, that must be Petawawa, because I didn't have my geography quite down. But then I found Petawawa on the map and realized, wait, that's down there. So what is this blue pin way up to the north? And I clicked on it, looked at the eBird records, and this is a confirmed, documented with audio recordings occurrence of Kirtland's warbler on a jack pine plantation that is fully 60 miles north of the Petawawa site, where they're also known to occur. And so what that shows is that these birds, they're able to find this, even though this is a disjunct patch of suitable habitat, at least 60 miles away from anything else that might be of interest to them. Some birds manage to find this. So it shows that this prospecting range, looking for additional habitat that we detected with the Motus towers, that's probably just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the ability of these birds to move around on the greater regional landscape, which is really impressive. Okay, so what can Kirtland's warbler do in the face of climate change? Well, it can do what it has always done through the millennia. It can move. So it can do this on a number of different scales. So it can find new habitat patches locally. Okay, this habitat patch is not dense enough, it's too old. I can find something else within a couple miles of here, no problem. It can also shift in response to appearances of new blocks of suitable habitat on a regional scale. So here, this is a photo of the Duck Lake fire. That's actually the shore of Lake Superior. And so the Duck Lake fire burned several thousand acres right up to the shoreline of Lake Superior. This is in the eastern Upper Peninsula of Michigan. This is an area where the Kirtland's warblers were not really known to occur, but about 5 or 6 years after this fire, we've got Kirtland's warblers appearing in a new big block of habitat that was created by a wildfire in an area that they weren't really known to be prevalent before. So they're able to move regionally from, some of these are probably birds from the lower peninsula that moved to the upper peninsula. And now as we get into even bigger spatial scales, now we start getting some questions. Might the Kirtland's warbler be able to expand its breeding range north? So this map shows the range of jack pine, which is closely associated with Kirtland's warbler. And you see that jack pine has a huge range relative to the range of Kirtland's warbler, which is this very restricted range. So obviously that shows that jack pine alone is not sufficient for suitable Kirtland's warbler habitat, but does also suggest that Kirtland's warbler may be able to shift its whole species range northwards into other areas that have jack pine, particularly if they're managed to create the kind of stand structure that's attractive to Kirtland's warblers. What about on the wintering grounds? So I talked about how the land area in the Bahamas might actually be shrinking. The habitat quality because of lack of fresh water and drought might actually be declining in the Bahamas in the coming century. What can Kirtland's warblers do in the Caribbean? Well, they might also be able to expand their wintering range. There are records of Kirtland's warblers appearing in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. There's records from Cuba. There's records from Turks and Caicos, and there's also a record from the Dominican Republic. So these are birds that can travel vast distances. They may be able to shift some of the population to wintering on some of these other islands. That is a very open question whether that's actually going to happen, but there aren't any physical constraints on them being able to do it. They can absolutely reach these other places if they're looking for additional wintering habitat, because what they have in the Bahamas is just insufficient. Okay, so that's how the bird can respond to climate change, but how can we respond to climate change in order to help the bird? So I've broken this into what can we professionals that are doing conservation work for Kirtland's warblers, what can we do versus what can just members of the general public do. So let's start with what professionals can do. So first, we can create more habitat for Kirtland's warblers, especially outside of that core breeding range of the northern lower peninsula of Michigan. And so this is actually already happening in the Upper Peninsula. The U.S. Forest Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are creating habitat on public lands for Kirtland's warblers. And what you see here in the Upper Peninsula map is two spots. This one is called the Baraga Plains area. There's a major Kirtland's warbler management project that's going to be getting underway in probably about 2 years at this site, but some of the initial paperwork has just been pushed through in the last couple of days, so that's very exciting. And then this area right here is the area of the Duck Lake fire, which was not intentionally created Kirtland's warbler habitat, but now that Kirtland's warblers are there, that area can be managed to facilitate their use of the landscape. And I should mention what these two maps are. These are maps that were generated by U.S. Forest Service scientists that are basically road maps for someone that would want to expand the breeding range of Kirtland's warblers, looking at suitable areas with the right kinds of soils, the right kinds of vegetation, including the presence of jack pine. And so areas that show up in particularly the green and the brown are areas that are quite promising if we're going to do targeted management for Kirtland's warblers. So in contrast to what's happening in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, over in Wisconsin, there's also Kirtland's warbler habitat work that's just getting started, but it tends to be more with private landowners. So American Bird Conservancy is working closely with some landowners in Adams County, Wisconsin, which is right here in central Wisconsin, where there's a little pocket of jack pine and sandy, well-drained soils. There are some Kirtland's warblers in this spot in Wisconsin already. So it's really just a matter of creating more habitat for them in this area. And then there's another area of interest in northwestern Wisconsin where there are some Kirtland's warblers, but there's a lot of interest in creating more habitat for Kirtland's warblers in this Pine Barrens area, in addition to sharp-tailed grouse management. I don't have it on the map, but there's also professional conservation work that's happening in Ontario, both in Simcoe County, which is right near the city of Barrie, and then also a project that's being led by the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust in an area that's about an hour to the east of Toronto. And so spreading out Kirtland's warblers as a species across the whole upper Midwest is a good strategy to hedge against climate change, because while we can model climate change, we don't quite know which of these areas are going to be most resilient to climate change. And so having birds in multiple different areas is really a good approach to de-risk the situation of having all the birds highly concentrated in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan. So apologies to those of you in Petoskey. We're trying to make your special little bird that's only found in northern Michigan, northern lower peninsula of Michigan. We're trying to get it to be found in some other places. So you won't get quite that unique claim to fame as much as you used to, but it's absolutely good for the species. Okay. On the wintering grounds, what can we as professionals do? So one of the things that's really critical is understanding what areas in the Bahamas are essential Kirtland's warbler habitat, and also what areas are going to be good habitat in the future. And right now there's a mapping project that's a collaboration between American Bird Conservancy, Antioch University, and the Bahamas National Trust to map habitat and identify those particular areas that are going to be most resilient to climate change, areas that have a little bit more topography. They're not going to get flooded if sea levels rise. They have a good source of a good fresh water table that's not going to have problems with salinity in the coming decades. And then also there are certain ways to manage for early successional habitat, that Kirtland's warbler really likes, also in the Bahamas. There's work with goat farmers. It turns out that goat farms are actually quite popular with wintering Kirtland's warblers because the goats maintain a certain level of disturbance that allows the early successional shrubs Kirtland's warblers really like the berries of to thrive. And so if you go visit these goat farms in the central Bahamas, you actually find a good number of Kirtland's warblers. So that's actually economic agricultural development that is compatible with ongoing conservation of Kirtland's warblers. And then once this map is created, we can actually use the map to search for new areas where Kirtland's warblers might occur. So it's important to realize that a good map that models habitat for a species can be not just descriptive, it can actually be predictive. So the modeling exercise might highlight areas that have not really been checked on the ground for Kirtland's warblers and say, yeah, you might want to check this island, or you might want to check this end of the island for Kirtland's warblers. They might actually really like this area. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we can all do. That was just things for professionals to do. But everybody can help Kirtland's warbler by doing a couple of things. So first, we can make migrations safer. A safer migration is going to reduce mortality of the bird. A more robust population is one that has more individuals that can contribute their genes to the next generation. There's more adaptive potential in a species with a bigger population. So things we can do to make migration safer include reducing collision risk. So this is primarily related to windows, but then also things like communications towers. And so ABC is engaged on both of these issues, one through the Bird Cities USA program that's just getting off the ground, which is going to be encouraging things like lights out during high periods of migratory bird activity. And then also ABC has a window testing program for different kinds of glass to think about glass technology and manufacturing processes that can make windows more visible to birds and reduce that mortality from just window strikes at night, usually during the migratory period. Everyone can also help reduce predation risk if you have a cat that is an outdoor cat, to bring that cat indoors to reduce the risk of a domesticated predator from killing a Kirtland's warbler in migration. Maybe you don't have a cat, but maybe you have a friend who does, and you might want to just send them cool pictures on social media of the catios and cats on leashes and those kinds of things that are fun, but encourage more stewardly ownership of domesticated cats. Everyone can also create stopover habitat. If you have a yard, you basically have a chance of having a Kirtland's warbler show up in your backyard, particularly in somewhere like Petoskey, where you're close enough to jack pine areas that Kirtland's warblers, we know they're on the move, right? They can appear in a variety of places. So how do you create good stopover habitat for a migrant? Well, you can do things like plant with native species. So there's a lot of studies that show that native plants are much better as both for structure, but especially for being a food source, either directly for the production of fruits or indirectly by supporting native insect populations that are critical to migratory birds that need a lot of calorie intake in order to successfully move around and get where they need to go. What else can we do? So we can also all collectively work to slow climate change down. So a lot of climate change has already happened and will continue to happen no matter what we do, but it's up to us. It's really incumbent upon us to slow that down and give all species, including the Kirtland's warbler, opportunities to adapt to what is going to be a changing planet. And so depending on your personal inclinations, this might mean advocating for climate policy, calling up your representative, or talking with friends and family, and really trying to encourage everyone to think carefully and politically, let's be honest, about how do we come up with sensible policies that slow down climate change. But then also we can think about just reducing our personal climate footprint, which for some of you might involve driving an electric vehicle or having solar panels or thinking about your diet. There's a number of different ways you can reduce your climate footprint, but it really does take a huge sustained collective effort to slow that process down and give these species time to adapt. Finally, I'll put in a plug for the Kirtland's Warbler Long-Term Fund. So the American Bird Conservancy is developing a long-term fund. This is a kind of a novel model to supporting a conservation-dependent species like Kirtland's Warbler. This fund is going to work like an endowment fund, and it's going to be an endowment for Kirtland's Warbler specifically. And the money that's generated by this fund will be used to support things like critical Kirtland's Warbler research, additional research using things like MODIS towers to understand where are Kirtland's Warblers going, when are they moving, how far are they moving in a given day, how can we protect them throughout their entire life cycle. And then also some of the funds will be used for things like essential management of habitat, areas where we know that we need to create more habitat to support a brand new colony perhaps, but also things that are not revenue neutral. You can do some timber work with Kirtland's Warblers to get a little bit of money, but usually Kirtland's Warbler habitat projects are ending up in the red on the ledger. Coming up with new economic models for how to support that activity is exactly the kinds of ideas that the Kirtland's Warbler Long-Term Fund is intended to address. Okay, so looking to the past to secure the future for Kirtland's Warbler. What we see about the Kirtland's Warbler is that these past movements of the warbler at many different scales, movements of the warbler locally, regionally, hemispheric scale movements of the species at many different time scales, just thinking about individual generations, but also thinking about the whole history of the species, roughly 2 million years, show that Kirtland's Warbler can adapt. It might be a fussy little bird and we think it's so finicky, how is it ever going to adjust? But it has adjusted in the past. So given enough time, this bird can adapt to climate change and all the other threats that it faces in the 21st century. And these natural history traits that have made it such a specialist, dealing with this ephemeral habitat that hopscotches around on the landscape, those natural history traits are not just a curse, not just dooming the species to always be rare. They are actually part of the Kirtland's Warbler's toolbox to adapt to a changing planet. And understanding even more about the movement ecology of the species is really going to be critical to guiding 21st century management for a Kirtland's Warbler and securing its future as a species, making sure that this beautiful bird is always part of our landscapes and our lives. So with that, I'd like to thank you for this very special Valentine's edition of the Petoskey Regional Audubon Society monthly seminars. If you want to learn more about the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team, you're welcome to email me. My email address is right there on the slide. You can subscribe to a quarterly newsletter that I produce called the Kirtland's Warbler Observer, which includes all sorts of updates on activities of the team, the conservation efforts across the landscape, profiles with individual conservation team members, also bits of natural history, interesting tidbits about the warbler. We also have a website, kwconservation.org, which includes donation links if you're interested in the Kirtland's Warbler Long-Term Fund, but also has a wealth of information on all things Kirtland's Warbler. So thank you. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Please feel free to put any questions in the chat box or just to unmute and shoot away. I will also throw this out there that Michigan Audubon, that they do tours of the Kirtland's Warblers habitat at Hartwick Pines Park, May 27th through June 30th. So if you have not had an opportunity to do that, that's a great opportunity.
Absolutely. I 100% recommend going on a tour. If you've never taken a half day to go see a Kirtland's warbler, you need to do it. It's a great joy.
Okay, we have a question in the chat about preventing bird glass crashes. Best ideas.
Yes. So this is something that American Bird Conservancy has done quite a bit of research on. And I've also done my own personal research. I've owned a couple of houses that have had collision problems. And there's a number of different products that are out there that you can modify windows with that I think are pretty effective. American Bird Conservancy has something called bird tape, which is a semi-translucent tape that you can actually put strips on windows, and it allows light through, but birds can see it quite easily and recognize that it's not just another tree they're flying towards, but it's actually a hard structure they need to avoid. Another approach that I took, the tape you can see from the inside. So that might be something for a particular window you don't like the aesthetics. One way that I modified windows on my house in Colorado that had collision problems was I took fishing line and actually ran lines of fishing line across the surface of the window. You need to get the spacing about 4 inches. But fishing line has a particular reflective quality that birds can see quite well, but we can't. So fishing line is just about invisible unless you're right up against a window, but you can use like a fishing line curtain, or do what I did, which was like get like little hardware eye hooks and thread the fishing line through in a little pattern to create a grid on windows. There are also films you can put on windows. There's a number of different strategies that you can use. The American Bird Conservancy website actually has a really great guide to window retrofits to deal with collisions.
Thank you. We have another question. Any estimates on mortality rates of collisions with windmills?
Yeah, there are some estimates. They all need to be taken with a grain of salt because there's still just not very much data on windmill collisions, and depending on the siting of the windmill, it can be quite difficult. Industrial environments you can get better data, but offshore wind farms, including some that are proposed for areas of the Great Lakes that are pretty critical to Kirtland's warbler migratory pathways, it's very, very difficult to get mortality rates when a bird hits a windmill and just drops into Lake Huron, for example. How do you know? So the challenge with windmills overall, my personal take on it is that I think wind energy is a critical part of a renewable energy mix. It's just essential. But it comes down to windmill siting. Can we get enough information on the movement ecology of migratory birds, things like using radar and MODIS data and geolocators to figure out where are these areas we really need to avoid putting additional hazards for migratory birds. And so in some cases, I think the data that we do have is heeded by wind developers, and in other cases, it's clearly not. So that requires a little bit of nuance in the conversation surrounding large industrial scale wind farms, but also additional sophistication in terms of the people that are making the policy regarding wind development. And that sophistication comes only with pressure from constituents.
All right, we have one more question for you, and that is, when can we expect the Kirtland's warbler arrival and departure?
Yes, that's a great question, a burning question, as we think about spring arrivals of various species. So Kirtland's warblers right now are still in the Bahamas. I will actually be going down to visit them in the Bahamas at the end of March, which is really exciting. We're going down to visit with some of our conservation partners in the Bahamas and work on developing conservation capacity down there. They will remain in the Bahamas until probably about late April. It tends to be about like the third or fourth week of April when they really mobilize from the Bahamas and start making their way northwards. But they move quite rapidly northwards in this rush to get up to the breeding ground once it's no longer buried in snow. And you can expect that Kirtland's warblers will be arriving in early May. So they can make the journey. It's about, I think, 1,700 miles, and they can make the journey in something like 10 to 12 days, which is really remarkable for a bird that I think weighs about the same as a nickel. But yeah, for sure by mid-May, by May 15, there are males that are quite prominently singing away, staking out the best territories. But even before that, some of those early birds might be showing up by the first week of May.
All right, wonderful. Well, I don't see anything else in the chat box. Oh, Doug?
I see a hand up.
Oh,
yeah.
Go ahead, Doug.
I'm sure you know there's a proposal to greatly expand the Michigan National Guard base by acquiring, I think, something like 160,000 acres. I can't remember the exact number, but is that a concern for Kirtland's warblers?
Yeah, so that's definitely a controversial issue. I am not super up to speed on the latest details of that, so I'm going to speak in vague terms about it. But it is something that the Kirtland's warbler conservation community is aware of. There's one of the partner organizations of the conservation team, the Kirtland's Warbler Alliance, really specializes in Kirtland's warbler related lobbying efforts and relationships with policymakers. And so they are directly engaged on that particular issue. So there are plenty of activities on that military installation that are completely compatible with Kirtland's warbler management. They have had Kirtland's warblers on that installation in the past. And so there's no reason that it is inherently a problem. However, it comes down to the details. Now, my understanding is that that particular expansion of the base is intended to be, or at least it's described as by the people that want it to happen, as sort of a low impact lease from the state of Michigan, where they need large areas to conduct particular kinds of exercises, but none of the exercises themselves are going to be high impact activities. We're not talking about tanks and live fire exercises. It's more like testing out communications equipment at long ranges and those kinds of things, or at least that's my understanding of it. So certainly it's something that is on the radar of the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team. And hopefully if it happens, it can be done responsibly in a way that doesn't impact any Kirtland's Warbler habitat.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for this incredibly informative presentation. We appreciate it and look forward to hearing other great things going on with regards to the Kirtland's warblers. So if none of our other guests have anything else to say, we can wrap this up. Well,
thanks everyone so much for your attention. It's fun for me to get out and share the exciting work of the conservation team with the broader audience. I will be at the Kirtland's Warbler Festival coming up first weekend in June. So if you're interested in getting even deeper into Kirtland's Warbler stuff, you're welcome to, or want to do one of the tours. That's a great opportunity to connect with other warbler heads. I don't know if they call themselves that, but they could be warbler heads, and meet some of the other members of the conservation team as well that will be at that event.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Go enjoy your Valentine's Day.
Oh, I see another question in the chat about what can I plant in my yard for Kirtland's warblers. So I would like to address that one. I don't know that there's a whole lot that you can that you could specifically plant for Kirtland's warblers, other than I'd say native plants are just going to be the best for all migratory species. There's so few Kirtland's warblers still. There's only about 4,700 of them, that the odds of your specific yard and that particular plant that you would put there getting a Kirtland's warbler to engage with it in any way is still pretty low. Hopefully it will continue to go up in terms of probability. But focusing on native plants for migratory birds, particularly native shrubs, something like serviceberry, native viburnum species, those kinds of things would be really great for birds in the fall when that fruit is available to them. But I guarantee you, if you plant good native shrub species, you will get some really fun migratory birds that will show up in your yard to feed on that fruit. The gray catbirds and hermit thrushes and those kinds of things, as well as some of the warblers that might be getting some of the earliest fruits coming through. Kirtland's warblers also really do like blueberries, just like us. They eat a fair number of blueberries on the breeding grounds. But if you plant those, then you might not get Kirtland's warblers because the blueberries are in July when they're going to be on their territories and not necessarily migrating through your yard. But you will get blueberries. So, you know, that's a win no matter what you do.
Thank you very much.
The
Thank
opinion
you.
is not there.
Thanks, everyone. We're going to wrap her up.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening and
Thank
happy
you.
Valentine's Day.